Okay, the next thing I want to do is to use some of the more advanced data components in Grasshopper to give more definition to this twisting tower. And the first thing I'm going to do is, instead of just having the two ellipses define my tower, so I have the base ellipse and the top ellipse, I'm actually going to use the series node to create a series of numbers that will instantiate a few different levels in my tower. So to create a series component, just type in series. And what the series component will do is we'll take a starting number and an increment step size and count, and it'll create this many numbers each time adding an increment to the starting number. So I'll show you an example of this. For the starting number, I just have to specify where I want to start, and I'll just keep the default at 0. And then the step size, I'm going to make a slider, and this will dictate the number or the increment between my numbers, or in this case, the distance between my ellipses. So here I'll just make a slider, start at 2, and then the count will be the number of values that generate, or in this case it'll be the number of floors in my tower. So here I'll just start with 20. So this will create 20 values starting with 0 and each time incrementing by 2. And to make this easier, we can start to rename some of these parameters. So here I'm going to rename this floor to floor, and I'm going to rename this to number of floors. Okay, so you can start to rename your parameters to make it a little bit more clear, obvious what these parameters are driving in your final model. Okay, so once I have these values, I'm going to use these values to drive my move object. So instead of specifying one move, I'm going to plug in all of these values into the z vector. So you see what that did here is when I plugged these values in, it actually created a series of vectors with that number as the z value, and it plugged all of these z vectors into this move node, and it actually created a piece of geometry for all those vectors. And you can see in Grasshopper there's a different representation when you start to plug in more than one value. Here we're always working with single values, so you get one value in, one value out. When you start to plug in multiple values, so here's a list of 20 values, you get this fat pipe, and this tells you that you're working with an array of numbers. And Grasshopper has a variety of ways to dealing with arrays, and it's something that you kind of have to learn from experience, but it could be a very powerful tool. It can also be sometimes confusing if you're not giving Grasshopper what it wants or in the right format. But in this case, what the move node will do basically is take one piece of geometry here, and it'll apply that transformation 20 times to create 20 pieces of geometry. And in this particular case, that's exactly what we want. So I'm just going to disconnect temporarily my loft and rotate node so we can clearly see what's going on with the move node. Okay, so this will give us basically 20 floors with 2 units floor to floor, and I can adjust both those parameters to start to change my geometry. So this will be a little bit abstract, just to get something that looks about right. Okay, so now we have those ellipses, and we want to reapply our rotation. So in this case, we can't just rotate the top one and loft through it. We have to somehow rotate all of these floors incrementally at the same time. And for that, I will use another data management node in Grasshopper, which is the range node. So to create a range, I just type in range here, and range will ask me for a domain. So this is the actual range of numbers that I want to use. So from the min to the max number, and then I give it the number of values that I want it to take along that range. So if I specify 0 to 10 with 10 values, it's going to give me all the integers between 0 and 10. So for the domain, you can see here there's default 0 to 1. So the domain I can type into a panel. So here if I make a panel, I can just type it exactly in the same syntax. So I can say, in this case, maybe I want 0 to 180 degrees, and it will actually accept this as a constant to the domain. So you can see now it's 0 to 180. So we'll start with that. I'll show you another way to do that more parametrically in just a second. So now number of steps, we have 10 as the base, and this works for now, but we actually probably want to plug in this 10 here because we want the number of increments of twisting to match the number of floors always. So here I'm just going to go ahead and plug this 10 into here to my range component, and what you see happening now is that I get 10 values for the floor. So this is how many floors I have and the height of each floor, and now I have a range of twist degrees from 0 to 180 evenly distributed. And now what I can do is just like here where I plugged a series of numbers into this z vector, I can plug this series of numbers into my rotation. So again, you see the fat pipe, which denotes that you have a list of values being passed, and here it's converting all of them to radians and passing them into this rotation. So what you see now is that we have 10 pieces of geometry and 11 angles. So there's a bit of a mismatch, and this is because here we generated 10 numbers for our translation, but the range, if you give it 10 steps, it will actually create 11 numbers because it's also taking the minimum and the maximum value. So it's stepping 10 times, creating 11 numbers. So here we actually want to change this number to be one less than the number of floors. And that's pretty easy to do. There's a series of shortcuts for basic math operations. If I want to subtract 1 from a number, I can just double click on my canvas and type in -1, and it will automatically create a subtraction node, and it will automatically set b, which is what I subtract, to 1. So here I'll just plug in 10 into the first value, it'll subtract 1 and give me a 9. So now I'm creating 10 values, which is what I wanted, and now I have 10 values in the angle parameter, and I have 10 pieces of geometry, so I can plug that directly in. So now you can see that there's a fat line going to both the G and A. And unlike before when we had one piece of geometry and 10 values, which created 10 pieces of geometry, now we have a matching number of values going in, so we have 10 and 10. And what Grasshopper will do in this case is it'll match them up one by one. So it'll take the first ellipse, rotate it the first value, the second ellipse, rotated by the second value, and so on and so forth, and generate 10 different ellipses. So this is another particular case of how Grasshopper handles multiple values in the inputs, and there's different cases that we'll cover in the future demos. So now I have these 10 ellipses, and I can plug them directly into my loft to loft through all of those curves. And at this point, it's a little bit messy, so what I like to do is select everything by hitting Control A. That selects everything on the canvas, and then I can either center mouse click, which gives me a series of shortcut icons, or I can right mouse click anywhere on the canvas. It'll give me those same shortcuts in the list, and I can just go to preview off for everything. So this will turn everything off in the preview, and then I can just right click on the component I want to see and hit preview. Okay, so now we have a version 2.0 of our tower. We have the same number of sliders, but now the geometry is being created in a slightly more nuanced way. So we can still control the base geometry of the floors, but now we have control over the floor to floor, the number of floors. Okay, so if we want to get a little bit more control over how the twisting works, we can actually start to play with the domain that's going to this range. So right now I have a kind of hardwire to go from 0 to 180. If I want to start to mess with that range, I can create a domain constructor, so construct domain node. And this will basically take two values and construct this kind of domain. So right now it's defaulted to 0 and 1, and this domain will go from 0 to 1. So now I can plug in my values here. So for the first one, I'll just have a constant. So for constants, I like to create just one of these panels and type it in. And this is just so I can always see what's going on, but I don't need to vary this really, so I don't need to create a slider. And for the other one, maybe I'll create a slider that goes to 360 for full rotation. And now I can vary how this domain works. So now I'm going 0 to 360. If I start to vary this, I can change that maximum rotation. And then I can plug this into the domain. Okay, so now I can actually vary how my twisting works, and the twisting will be applied gradually from floor to floor.